Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for the opportunity for being here. It's always a pleasure to really have an opportunity, especially as a researcher, to have a chance to talk to the educators who are really doing the great work on the ground and talk about really the potential the civics education have. But what I'm supposed to do today, and delighted to do, is really set up the stage for you all to get some context in terms of what civic engagement looks like today, especially after the 2016 election, and in the context of other educational reform buzzwords and trends that are happening, and what it means to be teaching civics education in that particular dynamic context. But first, I want to give you a little bit more on sort of where I'm from so you get a sense of what I do on a daily basis. So Circle, the organization that I lead, is based at the Jonathan M. Tisch College of Civic Life, as Martha kindly referred to. And it's really a one of its kind in some ways at Tufts University and nationwide in that it is a college with a dean, but we have no students or no major. At the same time, we have the ability to reach out to the entire university, arts and sciences, engineering, medical school, veterinary school, dental school, and Fletcher, because we don't really have that wall of departmental silos. And it's been really interesting place to be because we have a three-pronged mission of practice, education, and research. And I lead one of the research institutes. We have two over there. We also have student programming that really is designed to educate all Tufts students to be the active and productive citizens for tomorrow. We also connect with the community partners, including ourselves, but also our community partnership director, to really ensure that the work that we do, both in terms of research and education, are founded and grounded in the community identified needs. Circle itself is a nonpartisan research organization that's been around since 2001. We were founded at University of Maryland and moved to our current home in 2008 at Tufts University. This is the kind of stuff that we do at Tisch College. You can see students sort of doing service abroad. We have a one-year gap year program where they are immersed in this program service for a whole year before coming to the university after they get admitted. You also see students engaged in organizing, doing electoral college mapping, also doing some campaigning over there, and we have the great pleasure of welcoming great speakers like Congressman Clark on our campus, talking about their dedication to civic life and what it means for young people and educating young people. Our strategy tends to be that we really do try to focus our effort on really doing it all in some ways. We try to really support the research field of other scholars by disseminating the work they do, but also producing our own research. Again, that's grounded in the field identified needs. We almost always partner with other organizations and teachers, including iCivics and Randell Center, to really think about what are they asking on the ground, what are the questions that are emerging in the field, how can we answer that question using rigorous research so that it can again give it back to the research practice and policy. So that's how we are. And this is sort of what I want to talk about today in terms of roadmap. So I'm going to talk about where we are. We'll talk a little bit about sort of what's been happening in the 2016 general election, but sort of what led up to where we are today in terms of youth civic engagement. With that context, I'd like to talk about what civics education can potentially do when we all come together to make that effort, and talk a little bit about what going beyond content would look like. Of course, Dr. Herzog would be doing exactly how to do that, but what I want to give you is sort of a vision of what it might look like. I don't teach, but I'd like to talk about the vision. So, youth civic engagement today, as you probably all agree, there were a lot of concerns about whether young people, and by that I usually mean people under 35 currently. When you talk specifically about electoral engagement, oftentimes youth vote usually means under 30. That's simply because that's how they cut the data. But either way, a lot of people are worried that the young people would stay home, and that's especially because they were really engaged in the primaries to support Senator Bernie Sanders, and when he wasn't able to win the nomination, many young people were understandably disappointed, but then a lot of older folks said, well, then that means you won't turn out, right? You'll just stay home because you're just disappointed, you're just sort of not going to turn out because you're lazy. we really try to encounter that, narrative with the data, which is that, young people's turnout has been really stable since about 1976, I would say, at least for the presidential elections. And actually, it really goes up and down depending on how much outreach happens to young people. The fact is that, about a quarter of young people get any kind of outreach from campaigns or a third-party group or nonpartisan groups prior to the presidential election, and that's about half as much as older people. That trend has actually gotten worse in recent years when sort of election data technology has advanced so much that we know exactly the probability that one person next to you would vote and maybe what kind of yogurt they buy, and based on that, what kind of partisanship they might have. There's a lot of data about all of us, and the election outreach really utilizes that. As a result of that, young people really tend to be left out of the campaign outreach. For one, they have shallower voter history simply because they're young. They move around more often, so they have fewer years in the current residence. They often also have shallower credit history. All those things make them less likely to vote according to the data, and therefore they don't get the outreach. And that's a vicious cycle. You don't reach out to them because the data suggests that they have low propensity to vote, so you don't reach out to them, and therefore they don't come out to vote. Despite that, we didn't actually see the decrease in turnout in 2016. As far as we know, and this is before the census data comes out in spring or summer, about 50% of young people voted. And this is based on the national exit poll. And young people are about the 19% of the electorate. And that is pretty much exactly the same as how they turned out in 2012, at a little bit lower than 2008, which was a historic turnout year. In terms of the support, as you all know, the young people were one of the groups that really supported Hillary Clinton by a large margin, about 55% to 37%, but that support was slightly lower than they had given President Obama in 2008. That number was 66% for a Democratic candidate and 60% in 2012. There was a little bit more third-party vote, but not as much as people worried about. So that's sort of the general election stats. I could talk about that for 3 more hours, but I won't. What we know, though, is other stuff. So in terms of the turnout in presidential, I said it's pretty stable, but in the midterms, the turnout is actually on a decline. And the last time we measured, which was 2014, the turnout among youth was 19.9%. So 4 out of 5 young people did not vote when they were eligible in midterm. That number used to be more like 30% in the 70s and 80s, so there's been a really slight decline, but continuously declining over time. A recent study of mayoral election turnout also suggested that the median age of mayoral election voter is, do you know this? 57. 57. So really what the study showed was that the young people were essentially letting their aunts, uncle, usually grandparents, decide what's going to happen to the city. So the turnout at the local state levels are even lower. So now election turnout is really not all that great in some ways. I would argue that none of these is high enough in terms of participation, and I'll also show that the participation isn't equal. On the upside though, the volunteering is actually up since the boomers' youth. There's a lot of opportunities. Some states actually implement the requirement for high school students to do service in the community. Colleges and universities really encourage students to do that. AmeriCorps and AmeriCorps Vista are another ways in which young people can serve. So there is a lot of opportunities, and young people actually like doing community service because they feel that they have a direct impact, and that tends to be the trend. Now, millennials are also inventing new ways to engage outside of volunteering and voting. Some of it has to do with really the surge of social media's use in really organizing people that are like-minded around an issue no matter where they live, and quickly coming around to organize or start a petition both online and on the ground. Shared economy is actually another way that we might think of civic engagement, or the ways in which young people are really trying to innovate by trying to solve problems of maybe, dormant economy, or people just not having opportunity to go to work through the cars because they don't have a car. Another way is that young people are leading maybe social enterprise. Young people feel that the government and systems are sometimes too slow to make the change that they want to see, so they often start a business or nonprofits that they feel that can problem solve. Now, there are some worrying signs. One of them is a really well-known study that's been pushed back as of yesterday by Southern Poverty Law Center that, really documented about 10,000 teachers in talking about how they're starting to see a lot more violence, fear, and hate in their classroom, especially targeted towards students of minority background, immigrants, LGBTQ backgrounds. This is one of the quotes from the students from New York that said, they're having more fights in the first 10 weeks of this year than in the first 10 years of my career, and this is just my 11th year of teaching. So that's one illustrative quote. I would also, just to be fair, note that, while the 40% of the 10,000 teachers recorded incidents of hate towards students of minority background, the study also didn't talk about the 20% of teachers who also reported harassment against white students who supported Donald Trump before the election. So just want to make sure there's a balanced perspective here. But my point actually remains the same, which is that there's been a lot of conflict within the classroom, and teachers are really having to deal with the kind of divides that they had never seen before. And I think that's really important to take away from that. In terms of the way young people voted, that sort of hatred and divides was really clear, both in the exit poll survey as well as the pre-election survey the Circle conducted. This is the voting pattern by race among young people compared to 2012 and 2016. And you can see the divides were already there, except, it really is always huge. So only 43% of young people who are white actually voted for Hillary Clinton, compared to whopping 83% of African American youth and 70% of Latinos. And that is a big difference. And that difference wasn't actually just about race. There was a huge divide by religious affiliation, big divides by gender, especially among moderates, and also by urban and rural divides. So there are a lot of ways in which identity really played a role in people voted, and it was really, really big difference no matter what group that we looked at. This is a result of the survey that we conducted before the election, looking at the millennials from the nation. And you can see from looking at different colored bars representing white, African American, and Latino youth, how different the worldviews was already before the election. For example, 23% of African American youth thought that the police could be somewhat or completely be trusted, compared to 63% of whites. And then when it came to something like Democratic Party, that pattern was opposite. 23% could trust the Democratic Party among whites and 47% among African American. Same with president and military. Almost anything that we see, there is a pretty big difference. Another talk about the 2016 election was how that election and Donald Trump's presidency or candidacy at that point really mobilized working class people. And by that, they often mean by people with less formal education. This was actually not the case at all among youth electorate. Back in 2004 and 8 and 12, about 30% of the young people who voted did not have any college experience, not even one day of college experience. About 40% of youth citizen population fall into this category. In 2016, only 19% came in and vote, and they had no college experience. So actually, the electorate actually narrowed and shifted toward the more educated. And it also wasn't true that the people with college degree were less likely to vote. If it was really about the working class, as in middle, that class should expand and people with college degree should decrease. That wasn't also the case. 40% of the youth electorate had college degree, the 4-year degree, as opposed to mid to upper 30s in the past years. Another shift that we were noticing is the departure from the political institutions, especially the major parties. Young people swung to the left in terms of ideology, shifting from 32% saying in 2008 they were liberals to 37% in 2016, while the people that affiliated with the Democratic Party decreased by quite a bit. In 2008, they were pretty dominant force, 45% out of young people, and today it's just about as big as independents at 37%. So what we're seeing is that the young people are starting to really see misalignment between their rather progressive ideology, at least a good portion of them, and the party, of the Democratic Party, that for one, really sort of conflicted with their interests during the primaries, but also not moving in the direction they would like to see. So another trend that's really been really telling is the emergence of echo chamber, fake news, and news illiteracy. And that really has a lot of implications of what we need to do in classroom in terms of teaching. You know, it's really incredible how much leverage fake news has had and still does have today. I think there was a reporting about some cabinet member's son spreading fake news, and it's gone viral. And people really, even adults, have a really hard time sifting through the noise of the fake news and also just influx of information. For example, Sharonstein State Center in Harvard found before the election about 8% of the presidential candidate coverage was about the policies, and the rest was about the personalities and the scandals and everything else. But if you're really a young person trying to figure out what is it the young presidential candidate that I think I should choose is really gonna do, it's impossible. If you're sort of swamped with fake news that's coming from your friends that are pretty much one-sided, and yet some of it's fake and you don't know. And you have no idea what presidents are going to do, no matter what gets, who gets elected. And this is part of why we're hearing from young people, there's a lot of rhetoric about, it doesn't matter who gets elected. I don't know what they're thinking anyway, and they probably won't do anything important. And so that's part of why there was a fear of young people not voting. They turned out anyway, but there was a lot of distrust in the process of voting, according to a survey. So, moving forward from the election and civic engagement for a moment, and hopefully forever, for now. So what else is going on in the educational context in terms of things like educational reform? What I hear in my circuit a lot is this talk of a college career and civic readiness. I actually love the idea that they're all three together, but whenever I'm in a meeting with political policymakers and district leaders and state leaders, I actually often hear the civic part dropped completely. People often write it in the title and they say college and career readiness is really critical. So it really tells me a lot about how much priority civics is getting right now. There's a lot of conversation also about the similar concept that are called different things. Student agency, personalized learning, flipped classroom, competence-based education. I believe New Hampshire is competency-based? Yeah. It's really popular in New Hampshire right now. But it's really in some ways a lot of opportunity here, and I'm sure Michelle and others can talk about this and in terms of how the civic learning fits into this picture. I've also read a little bit about the New Hampshire's high school redesign, which has some promising things from what I can tell, like explicit teaching of key skills, multiple strategies for active learning, and real-world connections. So those are the things that they talk about in conjunction to the competency-based education and student agency and student-centered learning. But so far, I haven't seen a really strong integration of civic education into this conversation. I'm working on that, but essentially it's right now siloed, which is a problem. That brings us to the crossroad for the civic education. So the nation is really looking to understand what happened in the 2016 election, both in terms of how the election went, what kind of conversations were had, how much divide do we see, what are we gonna do in terms of young people. And so there is a lot of pressure on civics education. I haven't been asked this many questions about civics education in the past, especially right after election. It's been a lot of interest from the media and from stakeholders, and they just really want to know what can we do to fix whatever it is that they're thinking was a problem in 2016. Why I say this is a crossroad is because what people think happened actually depends on who you talk to. For some of us, it was about really the hate and sort of the violence and the racism and sexism and all of that. So we need to fix that. We need to be more inclusive. We need to really think about the cultural competency. For others, it was just simply fixing the systems of the electoral administration, like updating the voting machine and taking away the suppression law would be another way to do that. And others just think that we just need to tell young people the facts. If they just know the content, they would vote, because information is really the foundation of electoral engagement. So there is a lot of high demand for high-quality civics, but we need to really come together to decide what that means. There's a lot of different opinions out there from where I stand. There's also a challenging context that surrounded civics education before all this happened, which was that, especially in the poor districts who have majority minority students with lots of free lunch students, more pressure was placed on those schools to do well or better in the test. So studies found that the more testing pressure they have, the less time they have to spend on social studies and civics, because they're spending more time on math and science and ELA exam. Also, there's been a shift from more performance-based, or at least essay-examed assessment of civic knowledge and competency to multiple test, high-stakes testing. Now, I'm not necessarily against testing as long as it's actually testing the skills and competencies. There is an example like Florida's test that does that fairly well. But the fact is, if you have just a test that's based on the rote fact, teacher is going to be tempted to teach to the test. And that's really the easiest way for them to succeed. So I can simply not blame the educators for doing that, but that's certainly the way it is. In the meantime, there's been a lot of rules and laws and sort of implicit policies at schools that really discourages the idea that we live in a democracy for a specific population of youth. That's usually African American youth or immigrant youth or sometimes even girls. That really the school as a building often doesn't communicate the sense of fairness and justice. And those things happen by, for example, patting down the students every time they walk into the school to make sure they're not carrying the weapon, or whenever they act like teenager, they get to be thrown into jail. That happens in some schools. So that sense of lack of democracy really does a lot to how young people, especially coming from minority backgrounds, feel about democracy. In the meantime, inequality in both access to civic education, that's considered high quality experiential action civics, whatever, but also the kind of extracurricular activity that young people take on have really expanded based on where they live, which is really based on the economic inequality, as well as the kind of socialization parents give. So by the time students come to high school or college, they've had very, very different experience in terms of experience directly with civic engagement through parental and opportunity-based civic engagement, as well as the concept of citizenship and democracy. So again, in high school, there is a lot to sort of correct courses and make sure you restore the sense of democracy and sense of identity. On top of that, many teachers actually feel pretty unsafe teaching about the things that we think is pretty important. So when we surveyed teachers in 2012, this is when things are really good, comparatively speaking. Things are really nice then. I missed 2012 in so many ways. About a quarter of teachers actually felt that the parents and community members would actually object to them teaching high school civics and government, talking about politics in their course. And that sounds ridiculous, but that's what teachers said. And some of those teachers said that, back in 2008 when Barack Obama was elected and I had students watch inauguration and parents were outraged and they called me, they threatened to sue me, so I'm not gonna do it again. So the idea is that some parents and community members feel that when we talk about our political leaders who are now becoming increasingly partisan and extreme partisan, parents and community members often feel that the teachers are brainwashing their kids. Is content sufficient for a good citizenship? So I'm going to talk about this in the context of the citizenship test, which is now passed in 12 states, including New Hampshire. And it is an interesting movement that says, well, if the people that are starting to or wanted to be naturalized as a U.S. citizen has to take this test, I consider this quiz, actually, but our students should pass it too. And it sounds great because there is this 100-item test that's already on the books. Students can test it. There's all these materials available to study it, and that's all. So it can range from states that are saying this is a pathway to doing a lot more, just bring civics into the conversation because it wasn't even part of it. So by requiring something like that, we can start to bring civics more and more into the folds of our education, to states saying, great, we don't have to really teach civics anymore. We'll just have these tests and they'll pass, and then we got the civics done. So there's a huge range, but it is really gaining traction in many places. Now, if we were to talk about that side, great. We can just teach the facts and we can get done with it, and that's really sort of the content at the really lowest level. Would that be sufficient? And I think people here, if you're coming to this, agree to that. But of course, civic knowledge really isn't sufficient in that way. Of course, we need it, it's a requirement. But the fact is, every student doesn't necessarily come with equal value and experiences in civic engagement through their families. I talked about that already. And not every student believes that the civic knowledge is really useful and they would ever use it if they don't believe in the idea of democracy to begin with. Every student also doesn't come in with the skills to participate effectively in civic life. And not all students get to practice, try on democracy outside of the class. So, what do good citizens need? So, as I said already, civic participation requires more than content. And I do believe that the knowledge of civic structures, laws, and all that, really the content part of it, is at the heart of civics education. But civic life requires many more things. It's more like a puzzle. It's about authentic belief and participation, ability to reflect on their own action and decisions, discussion and listening and deliberation, and researching to make sure which information is actually worth consuming and which one's fake news, which one is powerful noise. Critical thinking about what we should do together, working across differences, and really just trying on the democracy. And part of that means that you are doing the work that citizens do, whether it's about the community engagement through service learning, or you could be talking about taking direct action against something that they believe is unjust, or you can be talking about, doing research to suggest a policy that might be helpful for the city or the government, or doing a social media campaign to make sure there's no more bullying on the social media within their school. It can take many, many forms, but it takes a lot more than civic knowledge, is my point. Unless they can really start to try on this idea of democracy and just practice it before they get on to college, civic life, voter, whatever it is, if they don't have that idea that democracy works in one way or the other, regardless of what political ideology they hold, and they start to form what it is, the role they play in the civic life. And that's what I mean by civic identity. I think we really do injustice in serving our needs in our society, not just with individual students. So some of these are what practicing democracy looks like. Some of it is sort of this meetings where students are deliberating on a topic and deciding what to do next. There's also community garden project here, mock trial, and mock election. Some of these really ranges in the levels and requirement and age group, but those are all examples. I think I really believe in the power of civic education in transforming a society. So thank you for your attention.